Richard Walker stares at the email on his phone, his hand trembling slightly as he reads the subject line for the third time. Notice of majority acquisition, MomConnect Technologies. The boardroom around him feels smaller than it did an hour ago, when he still believed his company belonged to him. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, he can see the city sprawling below, but all he can think about is the woman he laughed at 6 months ago. Sarah Greene's name appears at the bottom of the email as Chief Executive Officer. The same Sarah Greene who stood in this very room with a crumpled business plan, asking for a chance. The same woman he dismissed with a wave of his hand and a smirk that felt so natural then, so devastating now. His phone buzzes with a text from his assistant. She's here for the transition meeting. Richard closes his eyes and remembers the sound of her voice when she first pitched her idea, steady, hopeful, determined. He remembers his own laughter echoing off these same walls, and now she owns 51% of everything he built. If this story resonates with you, I'd love to know where you're listening from in the comments below. These tales of quiet strength and unexpected triumph seem to find us when we need them most. Please subscribe for more stories that celebrate the power of never giving up.
Richard Walker built his empire on saying no. As CEO of TechFlow Industries, he prided himself on spotting weak ideas before they wasted his time. His corner office on the 40th floor overlooked a city full of dreamers, and he considered himself their necessary wake-up call. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Richard adjusted his Italian silk tie and reviewed the day's pitch presentations. 3 startups, all begging for his investment. His assistant knocked and entered with his usual morning coffee. Black, no sugar, like everything else in his life. "The first presentation is ready, Mr. Walker," she said, placing the cup on his mahogany desk. "Send them in. Let's get this over with." The first 2 pitches blurred together. Young men in expensive suits talking about blockchain and cryptocurrency. Richard half listened, checking his phone, already knowing he'd pass. These entrepreneurs spoke his language, but they brought nothing new to the table. Then Sarah Greene walked in. She carried a worn leather portfolio and wore a navy blazer that had seen better days. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she had the kind of tired eyes that came from working multiple jobs. Richard noticed her hands, clean but rough, like someone who knew real work. "Mr. Walker, thank you for this opportunity," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I'm Sarah Greene, and I've developed an app called MomConnect." Richard leaned back in his chair. Another app, another dreamer who thought technology could solve everything. "It's a platform that connects working mothers with trusted childcare providers in their neighborhoods," Sarah continued, opening her portfolio. "The app includes background checks, real-time updates, and emergency contact features. I've been developing it for 2 years while working nights to support my daughter." She pulled out hand-drawn wireframes and printed screenshots. No fancy presentation, no slick marketing materials, just a mother who believed in her idea. "I need $200,000 to launch properly," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of everything depending on this moment. "I've already built a working prototype and tested it with 50 mothers in my community. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive." Richard glanced at her materials for exactly 10 seconds. He'd seen enough. Single mothers always had the same story. Some app that would change the world, built on hope and desperation. They never understood that business required more than good intentions. "Ms. Greene," he said, his voice carrying the practiced dismissal he'd perfected over 20 years. "I appreciate your passion, but this isn't scalable. Childcare is local, fragmented, and heavily regulated. You're essentially trying to build Uber for babysitting, and that's been tried before." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "With respect, Mr. Walker, this isn't just babysitting. It's about creating trusted networks for working mothers who can't afford proper childcare," Richard interrupted. "I understand the problem, but your solution assumes there's a viable market. Most working mothers in your demographic don't have disposable income for app-based services." He stood up, the universal signal that the meeting was over. "I wish you the best of luck, but this isn't the right fit for our portfolio." Sarah remained seated for a moment, her green eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Then she carefully packed her materials back into her portfolio. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Walker," she said, standing slowly. "I hope you'll remember this conversation." Something in her tone made him pause, but he shook it off. Another dreamer making empty promises about proving him wrong. He'd heard it all before. After she left, Richard returned to his desk and made a note in his calendar. Childcare app. Pass. Unmarketable demographic. What he didn't know was that Sarah had been cleaning his office building for 3 months, working the night shift to pay for her daughter's daycare while developing her app. She'd walked past his office countless times, studying the man who held her future in his hands. She'd practiced her pitch in empty conference rooms after mopping the floors, and she'd been watching him long enough to know exactly what kind of man he was.
3 months after the meeting, Richard had forgotten Sarah Greene's name, but Sarah had been busy. She'd taken his rejection and used it as fuel. Every night after cleaning offices, she refined her app. Every weekend, she networked with other mothers, building the community he said didn't exist. She contacted other investors, smaller firms that understood markets Richard had never bothered to explore. The first sign of trouble came during Richard's quarterly board meeting. His assistant handed him a folder of industry reports, including one titled Emerging Markets in Family Technology. He almost threw it away, but something made him flip it open. There, on page 12, was a featured article about MomConnect. Revolutionary childcare app reached 10,000 active users in first month, the headline read. Below it was a photo of Sarah Greene, looking confident and polished in a professional headshot. Richard's coffee grew cold as he read. The app had launched in 3 cities and was expanding rapidly. Parents were calling it life-changing. Investors were taking notice. The article mentioned a Series A funding round that had raised $1.2 million. His phone buzzed with a text from his business partner. "Did you see the Greene article? Didn't you pass on this?" Richard's face flushed. He'd dismissed her as unmarketable, but she'd found her market and dominated it. Worse, she'd made him look like an out-of-touch executive who couldn't spot obvious opportunities. But the real shock came the following week. Richard was reviewing acquisition targets when his assistant knocked urgently. "Mr. Walker, there's something you need to see." She handed him a press release with the TechFlow Industries letterhead, but he hadn't written it. TechFlow Industries announces strategic partnership with MomConnect Technologies, collaborative investment to expand childcare technology platform. Richard's blood pressure spiked. "What is this? I didn't approve any partnership." His assistant looked uncomfortable. "Sir, the board approved it. Yesterday. They said it was time to enter the family technology market. Ms. Greene's company approached us directly." Richard grabbed his phone and called his board chairman. David, what the hell is this partnership announcement? Richard, calm down. It's good business. This Greene woman has built something remarkable. Our investors are excited about the family tech sector. I rejected her months ago. She's qualified enough to build a company that's growing faster than anything in our current portfolio, David interrupted. Look, this isn't about your ego. It's about profit. Her app is projecting $50 million in revenue by year 2. Richard hung up and stared at the press release. Sarah Greene had outmaneuvered him completely. She'd gone around him, straight to his board, and convinced them to invest in the very company he'd rejected. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah Greene. "Hello, Mr. Walker. I wanted to personally thank you for the partnership opportunity." "This wasn't my decision," Richard said through gritted teeth. "I know, but your board was very interested when I explained how much market share we'd captured since our last conversation. They seemed surprised you'd passed on the opportunity." Richard could hear the smile in her voice. "What do you want, Ms. Greene?" "I want to succeed, Mr. Walker, and I want to prove that mothers like me understand markets that men like you can't even see." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I'll be in touch about the partnership details. Have a good day." The line went dead. Richard stared at his phone, realizing he'd underestimated Sarah Greene in every possible way. She hadn't just built a business, she'd built a weapon, and now she was pointing it directly at him. The partnership announcement was just the beginning. Over the next 2 months, Sarah Greene became Richard's nightmare. She attended every board meeting, arriving early and prepared with data that made Richard's traditional metrics look obsolete. She spoke the language of modern parenting, demographics, and social impact, concepts that resonated with younger board members who were already questioning Richard's leadership. During one particularly brutal meeting, Sarah presented user growth statistics that dwarfed anything TechFlow had achieved in years. MomConnect now serves 100,000 active families across 12 cities, she announced. Our retention rate is 94%, and our Net Promoter Score is among the highest in the industry. Richard watched his board members lean forward, engaged in a way they hadn't been during his presentations in months. Sarah commanded the room with quiet confidence, never raising her voice, never showing aggression. She simply presented facts that made Richard's dismissal of her look increasingly foolish. The childcare market is projected to reach $60 billion by 2025, Sarah continued. MomConnect is positioned to capture a significant portion of that growth, especially with TechFlow's infrastructure support. Board member Jennifer Walsh nodded approvingly. "Sarah, this is exactly the kind of forward-thinking investment we need. Richard, why didn't we see this opportunity earlier?" Richard felt every eye in the room turn to him. The market analysis at the time suggested the market analysis was wrong. Or perhaps it was looking at the wrong market entirely. After the meeting, Richard cornered Sarah in the parking garage. "You're trying to destroy me," he said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Sarah turned to face him, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp. "I'm trying to build something, Mr. Walker. You're the one who chose to stand in the way. I gave you honest feedback. That's what investors do. You gave me condescension and dismissal. There's a difference." Richard stepped closer, his frustration boiling over. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you've beaten me." "I think I've succeeded despite you," Sarah replied. "There's a difference there, too." She walked toward her car, then paused. "You know, I used to clean your office building. Building 47, 40th floor. I mopped the floors outside your office every Tuesday night for 3 months while I was preparing to pitch you." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "I listened to you on phone calls, talking about unmarketable demographics, and unrealistic expectations. I watched you dismiss ideas without really hearing them. I saw who you really are, Mr. Walker." She got in her car and rolled down the window. "I didn't set out to destroy you. I just refused to let you destroy me." As she drove away, Richard stood alone in the parking garage, finally understanding that Sarah Greene wasn't just a business rival. She was a reckoning he'd been avoiding his entire career. The next morning, Richard arrived at his office to find a letter on his desk. Not an email, a handwritten letter on MomConnect letterhead. "Dear Mr. Walker, I'm writing to inform you that MomConnect Technologies has received a strategic investment offer that would allow us to expand our partnership with TechFlow Industries. The terms would involve a controlling interest in TechFlow's family technology division with potential for broader acquisition opportunities." Richard's hands shook as he read. Sarah had found investors willing to buy into TechFlow itself. She wasn't just succeeding, she was positioning herself to take over his company. The letter continued. "I wanted you to hear this from me directly, given our history. I hope you'll understand that this is simply business, nothing personal." But Richard knew it was very personal, and for the first time in his career, he was terrified.
Richard spent the next week in a state of controlled panic. He called lawyers, accountants, and business advisors, but they all told him the same thing. If Sarah's investors had enough capital, and if the board approved the acquisition, there was nothing he could do to stop it. "You should have seen this coming," his lawyer told him bluntly. "She's been building toward this for months. Every partnership meeting, every board presentation. She was positioning herself as the future, while making you look like the past." Richard sat in his office, staring at the city below, finally understanding the depth of his miscalculation. He'd thought Sarah Greene was just another desperate entrepreneur, but she'd been playing a completely different game. His assistant knocked. "Mr. Walker, there's someone here to see you. She says it's about the MomConnect situation." Richard looked up to see an older woman in her 60s, well-dressed but with kind eyes. She introduced herself as Margaret Coleman, Sarah's former neighbor. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Walker, but I felt you should know something about Sarah Greene." Richard gestured for her to sit. "I'm listening." "Sarah's daughter Emma was born with a heart condition. Nothing life-threatening, but it required constant monitoring and frequent doctor's visits. Sarah was working 3 jobs to pay for health care, cleaning offices at night, waitressing on weekends, and doing data entry during the day." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "She developed that app because she needed trustworthy childcare for Emma during doctor appointments. The other mothers in our building were in the same situation, working multiple jobs, struggling to find reliable care for their children." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. "When Sarah pitched to you, she'd already been awake for 36 hours straight. She'd worked a double shift cleaning offices, then drove Emma to an early morning cardiology appointment, then rushed to meet with you. She'd been living on coffee and hope for months." Margaret leaned forward. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, Mr. Walker. I'm telling you because Sarah never mentioned Emma's condition in her pitch. She never used her daughter's health as a sympathy play. She believed her idea should stand on its own merit." After Margaret left, Richard sat alone in his office, thinking about the woman he'd dismissed so casually. He'd seen her tiredness and assumed it was weakness. He'd seen her simple presentation and assumed it was unprofessional. He never considered that she might be fighting battles he couldn't imagine. That evening, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He drove to a neighborhood he'd never visited before. He parked outside a modest apartment building and watched children playing in the courtyard. These were Sarah's customers, the unmarketable demographic he'd dismissed. He saw mothers picking up their children from the building's informal childcare center, mothers who looked exactly like Sarah, tired, determined,
making it work however they could. He watched them use their phones to coordinate pickup times and share contact information. For the first time, Richard understood what Sarah had built. It wasn't just an app, it was a lifeline for families like these, and he'd been too blind to see it. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Walker, this is Sarah Greene. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning. There's something we need to discuss before the board meeting." Richard stared at the message, knowing that whatever Sarah wanted to discuss would change everything again.
The next morning, Richard arrived at his office to find Sarah already waiting in the lobby. She looked different, more confident, more polished, but also somehow softer than she'd been during their recent confrontations. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said, as they rode the elevator to his floor. "I don't think I had much choice," Richard replied. Sarah smiled slightly. "You always have choices, Mr. Walker. That's what I've learned." They settled in his office, the same chairs where their first meeting had taken place 6 months earlier, but now Sarah sat with the quiet authority of someone who knew she held all the cards. "I wanted to talk to you before the board meeting this afternoon," Sarah began. "The acquisition offer is real. My investors are prepared to purchase 51% of TechFlow Industries, with me as the controlling partner." Richard nodded grimly. "And you wanted to gloat in person?" "I wanted to make you an offer." Richard looked up, surprised. "I don't want your company, Mr. Walker. I want your expertise. TechFlow has infrastructure and experience that MomConnect needs to scale globally, but I need leadership that understands the markets we're entering." She pulled out a folder, not the worn leather portfolio from their first meeting, but a sleek presentation binder. "I'm offering you a position as Chief Strategic Officer. You'd report to me, but you'd have complete autonomy over traditional tech sectors. I'd handle family technology and emerging markets." Richard stared at her. "You're offering me a job in my own company?" "I'm offering you a chance to be part of something bigger than your ego," Sarah replied. "You're a good businessman, Mr. Walker. You're just not a good judge of people." She stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city. "I don't need your apology, and I don't need your regret, but I do need your skills. The question is whether you can work for someone you underestimated." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you want to work with me after what I did?" Sarah turned back to face him. "Because Emma needs a world where women like me don't have to fight so hard to be heard. And changing that world requires working with people who have power, even when they've used it poorly." She returned to her chair. "I could destroy you, Mr. Walker. I could buy your company and fire you publicly. I could make you a cautionary tale about old-fashioned thinking in a modern world." Her voice softened. "But that wouldn't help the next mother who walks into someone's office with a big idea and a small budget. What would help is having someone like you learn to see opportunities where you once saw obstacles." Richard looked at the woman sitting across from him, the same woman he'd dismissed as unmarketable, unrealistic, unprofessional. Now she was offering him a lifeline he didn't deserve. "What about Emma?" he asked quietly. Sarah's expression brightened for the first time. "She's 7 now, healthy, happy, and excited that Mommy's app is helping other families. She doesn't know about our history, Mr. Walker. She just knows that people sometimes need second chances." Richard picked up the offer letter and scanned the terms. Fair, generous, better than he'd expected, better than he deserved. "I accept," he said. Sarah smiled and extended her hand. "Welcome to MomConnect Technologies, Mr. Walker. I think you're going to learn a lot about markets you never knew existed." As they shook hands, Richard realized that Sarah Greene had taught him the most expensive lesson of his career, that the most powerful people are often the ones who have the least to lose and the most to prove. 6 months later, Richard would watch Sarah ring the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange as MomConnect went public. He'd be standing beside her, no longer the man who said no to everything,
but the man who'd learned to say yes to possibilities he'd never imagined. But that's a story for another day.